Hi y'all, it is March 24th, 2020, and welcome to this episode of the Jaguar Paints. Today our piece is the gouache painting Lord V, and I'm super excited about this one because it's the first one I have videos for the entire painting process from the blue line all the way to the ending. I don't have that data for a lot of my paintings yet, so this was pretty cool. These are taken from my Twitch stream, which I then made far faster, about 600% speed. And a question I often get when I'm doing the streams is I like to do them late at night, and it's usually pretty dark, like the lighting is not great. That's because the lighting actually in my workspace is pretty dim as well, because I don't like to wake myself up with bright lights late at night. And so people ask me, well, but how do you know what color everything is if you don't have a good light source on it? And I guess the answer to that is I have been using these paints for so long that I just kind of remember that information. So I'm painting as much from memory of what the colors look like as from actual sight. And it never occurred to me that that might be weird, and yet I guess it is kind of weird. So I guess here I want to talk a little bit about the medium that I prefer to use, which is gouache. Gouache is a more highly pigmented version of watercolors. It has a lot of the same behavior that watercolors does, but it tends to be more opaque and more brilliant, and I prefer it because I don't really use watercolors the way that they are intended to be used, which is lots of glazes, lots of water. I like to work very dry. In fact, I tend to destroy my brushes because I dry brush with very sensitive brushes. These are all Kolinsky sables, and so they're the fur of some small mammal, and if you use them dry, you kind of destroy them very quickly. But this is the way I prefer it. I have been using M. gouaches for years now, and they remain my preferred brand. But in addition, lately I've been experimenting with some handmade watercolors from Quartz Creations, mostly because it's a great way to get glitter. And if I can use glitter on something, I will put glitter in something. And I know that's kind of a joke because everyone thinks of me as a ponies and rainbows kind of person. And I do like ponies and rainbows. I love glitter, not just because it's pretty. I love it because it adds a uniqueness to the original, which makes it impossible to duplicate. And while that's super bad for people who want to buy prints, it is very good for people who believe in the value of unique art objects. So particularly, a lot of my pieces, you don't really get the full effect of them unless you see them in person, because between the glitter and the sheen that I use on them, when you move, they change, and they change radically depending on where you're looking at them from. And I think that experience is very important to art because it grounds you in the moment, and it makes you more fully present when you're experiencing it in person. So I have no regrets making my paintings almost impossible to reproduce accurately. I think the personal and immediate experience of them is an important part of what they are. So yes, I love glitter. As you can see, I have moved into the coat, which I decided was velvet, and I'm using a lot of, I guess there's like 4 colors in there, maybe 5, maybe 6, maybe 6. It's a very limited palette picture. I decided to go with a modified version of contrasting colors because I knew that he was going to be blue-gray and he was going to be wearing blue. So I decided that I wanted to go to the opposite end of the color wheel for everything else, which would have been orange if I was going very specifically complementary, but I decided maybe a golden peach would be a nice oblique take at that. Anyway, it's kind of hypnotic to watch my own hand doing that. It's like, how do I even do that? I don't know. Even I find it mysterious at this speed. But anyway, there's Payne's Gray, Ultramarine, and 3 glitters in that, I believe. And I think that's good enough. Later there will be white. We're actually getting close to the end of this particular session, which I was live streaming. And the reason I stopped at that time was because this is a water medium, I need to give existing layers time to dry if I don't want to either smear them or pick up those colors when I'm doing something else near it. So this was the first of, I believe, 3 sessions during which I finished this. Now, almost every painting I ever do begins with a sketch that I do in a separate sketchbook. I do that because in order to finish a sketch, I do a lot of erasing and a lot of thinking on the paper when I do the sketch. And all that erasing and retracing would completely destroy any watercolor paper that I actually used. So my process involves doing the sketch on some robust sketch paper and then printing it out so that I can do the actual paint. And I believe I took a short video of the actual sketch and appended it to the end, so you'll be able to see that later. We've moved into the second session, which was during the day, which is why the lighting is very different. And this is the session where I finished the bulk of the work. I believe I was listening to Queensryche, which was kind of funny. Not really thematically appropriate for the drawing in question, but it was a lot of fun. Here's where I'm finally getting into that yellow that I mentioned that I wanted to use. Now, I know a lot of people mask their artwork so that they can paint over areas of it without having to worry about being precise on the edges and maybe messing up. But I hate masking. It's very tedious, and I also find that it pulls up the sizing of the paper. So the surface changes and then it doesn't act the way that I expect. And you really need the sizing on the paper for watercolor paper if you're going to have it work at all. So I don't use masking very often. To compensate for the fact that I need to do the edges perfectly every time they interact, I do a lot of rotation of my paper. I do it when I'm sketching and when I'm inking, and that's all about having my hand at the right angle in order to do things at the most natural angle for my wrist and my arm. And that keeps all the lines a lot more confident and prevents me from making like awkward bobbles when I'm moving. I know it's a little bizarre to see how often I do it, but as you can see, I have, this is me replacing the tape. The only thing I use the tape for in pictures like this is to give myself a point to steady the paper so that it doesn't fall, because my current painting desk is on an incline, which is a little bizarre for water media, and it took some getting used to, but I did it that way because it's easier to sketch that way, and I also sketch at that desk. If I can't get the eyes right, I might as well throw it away. So I try to do the eyes halfway through the picture to see if I'm going to have to toss the whole thing and start over. I use all round brushes. I don't know if you've noticed that by now, but most of the brushes all of the brushes I use are the same brand and the same animal hair, and they're all rounds. I don't use any other shape. I've tried, and sometimes I do that for when I'm using some other media like oil painting, but when I'm using gouache, I just use round brushes. I don't know. I've tried other brushes and I'm like, meh, I don't really need these. Now these darker colors that I'm using for accenting are actually a combination of the gray of his fur and the orange at the top. And it's kind of an interesting color. I think I photographed it later because it's unexpected. I'm using that toothpick there to put white highlights in his eyes because I'm using an acrylic ink for that, and it would ruin the brushes if it dried in it, so I didn't want it on the brush. I tend to work in layers when I darken things, but in the end I really do like them to be very powerful, very bright colors. I like looking at the sort of dreamy, soft, glazy, watercolory effect that other people who do watercolors do, but I don't like it for myself, so. So the other tool I use most often when I'm painting like this is actually my hand. I do a lot of stuff to the brush when I'm working with it. If it's too wet, I gently pull some of the water out of it before I use it. If I put something down on the paper and I don't like it, I will swipe it back up with my fingers. This shockingly actually works really well, and I love the feeling of connection it gives me to what I'm doing. It's a very tactile, interactive process where I feel like touching it changes it, and touching it directly changes it. And it's one of the reasons why I never really connected very well with digital media, because I love the tactility of doing work like this. I like getting my hands on it directly. I don't have, most of the work I do is very abstract. I write books. I talk to people on computers. I do so many things that are abstract. I read for hobbies as a pleasure, that to do something physical that involves using my hands directly is very satisfying. So, everybody's different. This just happens to be the way that I work and interact best with visual art. Outlining that child was a lot of fun. I don't often outline things when I paint, and it's actually quite enjoyable, so I think I might do it more often. Does it take a steady hand? I guess it takes a steady hand, but that's part of why I rotate so much, is so that my hand is always at an angle where doing that is easiest. I also like about gouache that I sometimes don't feel I have perfect control over it. Like, it also has a say in what I'm doing. And I like that it forces me to improvise sometimes, instead of just sitting there and doing exactly what I tell it to, because there's a bit of a feeling of adventure about, going at it with something that might do something unexpected and spontaneous that I find quite enjoyable. I like it. It stretches me and in a way that makes sure I'm never too comfortable. There's that peach I talked about. It's also got a lot of glitter in it. I also tend to work on a little bit on every little bit of the picture at once, like I move around a lot, so that it feels like I can do value checks and see if something's not working as it happens. So this is the point where I paused to allow it to dry. And here is the last session for this particular painting, which was also during the day. The ending of a picture is always kind of the hardest because it's tempting to just keep fussing with it. But, you know, nothing is ever perfect, so I feel like it's a good meditation to be able to say, this is good enough, and it serves its purpose, and I'm okay with it not being some platonic ideal. The last few things I had left were mostly clothing and the bottom of his body, which I was far less interested in because, you know, all the fun stuff was at the top with the shiny velvet and the crazy lace and the sword, which I hadn't even started doing until the very end. His vest is actually surprisingly detailed. It's not possible to see it in the Twitch video, but there will be a linked image at the end. So. Hi Chiyu sword. Add gemstones. Quick. I really enjoyed doing that sword. It was, usually I find swords very intimidating, but it came out surprisingly easily given how infrequently I find swords easy. I use water a lot to correct mistakes when I make a line that's too dark. I address it with water quickly. I really enjoyed the yellow in this one, but I use up yellow ochre at a rate that's really ridiculous. I happen to really love that color. This is also using one of the handmade paints in yellow called Buttercup, which I think was a very pretty color that I kept using, so I went ahead and bought it. I originally got it as a sample. I do like yellows. They're a lot of fun. So much tail. Someone asked me why I'm still putting dots on his paws for the claws, and that's because you can still see the holes for the claws even if there are no claws in them. So lots of shadows, in this case warm shadows because everything else is quite cool. That's me deciding which metallic watercolor I wanted to use to emphasize the little magical connection stuff that he's got going on in there. Then this last bit is adding the embroidery on the edge of his coat, which I did with acrylic white ink on the place where it should glow. And I used the gouache white because it would fade when it picked up the ground, so it wouldn't look quite so bright. I wanted it to reflect the shadows and the light. And that's it. Here is the final piece. And as promised, this is the actual sketch. And unusually for this particular, for me, it's almost exactly the same size. I usually paint larger than I draw. You can see all my little scritchy, scratchy lines in there. Right, trying to decide where everything goes. Here is my workspace at the conclusion of this painting. As you can see, it's quite a mess, for me anyway. The handmade paints there are in the tin, and the metallics are in their own little case. And then I have my permanent palette with my MCAH gouache and all the colors I used, which I mixed, and there's that kind of funky color there I was talking about. And that's the whole thing. Thanks for watching the Jaguar Paints. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe. You can check out my fiction at my website or support me on Patreon. Be well, y'all.